Hi, welcome back to ITC568. Today we're going to have a look at some guidance for assignment 4. So assignment 4, privacy and data strategy. It's worth 25%, so it's quite a reasonable one. You need to be involved in it. Due the 5th of October. Two types of submission. You've got a slide deck and a series of paper strategies. Let's go through it in detail. Okay, so we're looking at the same scenario we've been using before, the Department of Administrative Services moving to a shared services model. We've used this all the way through the assignment series so far, so this doesn't really change anything. They're mandating a cloud-first approach to the process of acquiring or updating software. Where we change in this assignment is the DAS has now decided and government has decided that they want to centralise the application and renewal of licences into a single portal called My Licence. So the reasoning behind this is the workflow for licence applications and renewals is basically the same for all types of licences, even though some of the data may differ. And if there are any differences, they can be tacked on at the end in order to accommodate that. From the government point of view, this gives a much better view of what licences each citizen holds, and it can be linked back to other data about each citizen. The process that the government proposes is that citizens can register on that My Licence portal. They will then create their own informal digital identity, and that allows them to view their licences, their renewal dates, and all the other associated information for their identity on a single page on the My Licence portal. So, as always, under the Cloud First proposal, the government then proposes to use a public cloud provider to host this portal, to process the data, and to hold the databases containing that. However, it is somewhat concerned about data sovereignty, so it wants to ensure all the data remains on Australian soil. So that way, try and prevent any issues around the data with My Licence. So, task 1. So, you've been successfully engaged by DAS before to provide security and risk assessments. You've now been engaged to look at a data and personal protection strategy for My Licence. So your first task is to develop a PII strategy, personally identifiable information strategy, for the My Licence portal. So your strategy should consider the risks and threats to both the privacy and data protection for any PII data collected in My Licence, as well as any possible controls to mitigate the risks, worth 25 marks. So now, what you need to do here, you've got to start to think of what are the particular threats and risks to this particular data set, right? What types of controls would you put in place to mitigate these threats? And so from that, you develop a strategy which says these are the risks, this is where things can go wrong, these are the controls we put in place, this is how it should affect it. So you need to put that strategy in a separate Word document. Now you have a maximum word count of 1,250 words, plus or minus 10% for this document, okay? Maximum word count. You then describe your strategy in your PowerPoint presentation, and it should describe your risks and threats, your strategy, how its proposed controls will work, and if possible give an example. Remember, you're presenting this to senior management, so if you can give an example, it makes it that much easier for them to try and understand where you're going with it. Question 2 is, now you've got to develop a strategy to protect that informal digital identity that a user can create in My Licence. Okay, so again, think about the privacy and data protection aspects for a digital identity, as well as the controls that you would use to mitigate any risks that you've identified for that strategy, for that particular digital identity. So my comments on this is you need to think about how would you protect a digital identity, a citizen's digital identity, right? You should think about the threats and the risks to that identity, what sort of controls you could use to mitigate it, how you would put it all together, and what's the strategy you would use to approach this particular problem. Again, your strategy goes into a Word document with, again, the maximum word count of 1,250 words, plus or minus 10%. and you describe that strategy as part of that one presentation to senior management in your PowerPoint thing. Then you talk about your strategy, its controls, the risks and threats, and so forth. Again, give some examples if you can, because that helps. Question 3 is to develop a strategy to ensure data sovereignty for the My License portal. So this is now where you're going to start thinking about, how do I ensure data sovereignty for this My License portal in the cloud? What are the sovereignty threats and risks to this particular data set? How do I mitigate those? Okay, so again, your strategy is in a separate Word document with a max word count of 1,250 words, plus or minus 10%. And again, you describe that as part of that presentation. And the final thing is that, in fact, the presentation, this is the PowerPoint or Google Slides preso that gives a comprehensive overview of those 3 strategies. Remember, a maximum of 30 slides. So you've got to condense everything back into 30 slides. Now, because you're including strategies here, you don't need to include speaking notes. Okay, so as always, you do have to include references. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But you will need a reference list at the end of your strategies, as well as in your PowerPoints, right? But for the PowerPoints, the reference list doesn't count. So remember, this is a presentation that you're probably going to give, probably firstly to senior management and then ultimately at the board level. So you've got to keep it concise, you've got to keep it accurate, and think about those examples and make sure they're pretty well on spec, that they really kind of work for you. So constraints that we've got in this. Your presentation must not exceed 30 slides. That includes your introduction, your conclusions, any recommendations if you want to include them. Your slide deck must have a reference list, and all the references are to be included on that reference list slide. But the reference lists slides are not part of your slide deck limit, so that's additional. So if you're putting images and quotations on slides, they must be cited on that slide, and you could put the citation in a text box underneath it or around it, whatever. Have a look at some of my lectures as an example of how to approach that. Each of the 3 strategies that you write have to be in their own separate Word document that is attached as an appendix, and so each of those documents have a word limit of 1,250 words, plus or minus 10%. Okay, so remember that presentation should really highlight the significant points of your argument, but the detail should be in your strategies. So be careful that you don't over-egg your presentation. Keep it hot, keep it quite tight. So if you go below 30 slides, that's not an issue, but keep it fairly tight so that you're talking to management so that they can understand it from the presentation without needing to really read the strategies. So the approach you could take with this is, you're tasked with developing specific strategies. So now you're probably in the position of a senior advisor to management. So you should be across the technical details, particularly stuff that management's not aware of or may only have some limited understanding of. But you should also be so aware of the technical details that you should have a good idea how to put them together in order to create a strategy that protects the data, right? And so your task in this assignment is to start to craft strategies to protect My License and its data so that management can start to make an informed decision about how to proceed. So remember, your presentation needs to be concise and accurate. It needs to provide any additional material and references if necessary. Always make a logical argument and provide any recommendations that proceed directly from your arguments. Don't just pluck one out of the air because it sounds like a good idea at the time. So finally, what I'm trying to do here is extend this real-world problem that we've been using. And the idea of having a single point of access for multiple government services has been the aim of many governments, as well as the bane of a few, over the years. So now what we're doing is we're looking at researching and developing and arguing a series of strategies for senior management to accept. And this is another step in this process of securing data and privacy in the cloud. So again, you've been dropped into a fairly contemporary problem that has some issues that really must be considered, particularly in a cloud ecosystem. So the whole idea of this assignment is to help you to research and consider them and think about how you'd need to approach them in an enterprise. I hope you enjoy this. It's kind of an interesting one, and good luck.